We are jumping straight in today with a really special paper from Disney Research Imagineering. It's called Olaf, Bringing an Animated Character to Life in the Physical World by Muller and team.
And this paper, it really tackles a core question for anyone in entertainment robotics. How do you take a character like Olaf, who has these completely non-physical proportions?
You mean the huge head, tiny feet?
Exactly. He's 88.7 centimeters tall, weighs almost 15 kilos, and is just fundamentally unstable by design.
Yeah.
How do you make that walk and, more importantly, make it believable?
And the solutions they came up with are what make this such a fascinating deep dive for anyone working on dynamic control systems.
For sure. I mean, first you have the mechatronics. They had to invent a novel asymmetric 6-to-F leg mechanism that's completely hidden under a foam skirt just to create the illusion of his movement. Then all of that core locomotion is driven by reinforcement learning.
But the real genius here, and what we'll get into, is how they tailored those RL policies to deal with the real-world problems that the costume itself created.
That's the key. They introduced two really novel rewards. The first is a thermal aware policy. It uses a control barrier function to stop the neck actuators from overheating inside the costume.
A huge physical constraint.
And the second is an impact reduction reward that quiets down the sound of the footsteps. We're talking a 13.5 D to B reduction, which is massive. It's this incredible fusion of character design and really advanced robotics.
Okay, so let's dig into that foundational idea.
Yeah.
When you and I think about legged robots, we're usually thinking about functional goals, right?
Boston Dynamics.
Exactly. Robustness, efficiency, climbing over rubble, hiking up a mountain.
Yeah.
But what happens when that entire engineering objective just shifts?
It pivots completely. It pivots to character fidelity. When you're building a robot for entertainment, the number one goal is believability.
So function is secondary.
It's not secondary, it has to be invisible. If the robot looks efficient, it probably looks robotic. And that breaks the illusion you've failed.
And Olaf's design is just the perfect storm of non-robotic constraints. That top-heavy body, the tiny little snowball feet, and he has to have this kind of floating, cartoonish walk. Yeah. I mean, that's a hardware nightmare from day one.
It is. The paper says it perfectly, that the illusion of believability is fragile.
I love that line.
Yeah, because if the gait is a little jittery, or if you hear a loud mechanical clank when a foot hits the ground, the magic is gone. Instantly.
So every single component, every motor, had to be completely hidden inside these really tight spaces under the costume.
And that's a huge challenge. I mean, we're talking about 25 total degrees of freedom.
25?
Yeah.
How do you even begin to package that inside a fluffy snowman? The leg mechanism alone must have been the biggest headache.
Oh, absolutely. The legs needed that full 6-to-F for the stylized motion, but they had to operate almost entirely inside the lower body's volume.
To get that floating feet illusion.
Exactly. And to make that work, they made a really radical choice. They just threw out the idea of a symmetric leg design.
Wait, they're not symmetrical. Why would you do that? Isn't symmetry like the cornerstone of stable mechanical design?
It usually is, yes. But here, asymmetry was the only way to solve the spatial problem. So one leg is basically an inverted version of the other.
How does that work?
So if one leg has, say, a rear-facing hip roll and a forward-facing knee, the other one has the opposite. A forward hip roll, rear-facing knee. And this really clever, non-intuitive design did two things. It maximized their workspace inside that tiny area, and, crucially, it stopped the hip actuators from physically crashing into the knees during complex movements. It even reduced the number of unique parts they had to make.
And this whole mechanism is hidden by the skirt, which isn't just a piece of fabric.
Correct. It's a flexible skirt made from soft polyurethane foam. It holds that classic snowball shape, but it can deflect and bend when the legs need to take a larger step.
And it probably helps if he falls over.
That's another key function, yeah. It helps absorb impact.
Now, hiding all those motors must have meant they couldn't just stick actuators at the joints for the face or the arms either.
No, they had to use remote actuation with linkages. For the shoulders, which are 2DOF, they use something called a spherical 5-bar linkage. It lets them place the actual motors up high in the torso, away from the arms.
And a similar idea for the face.
Yep. 4-bar linkages for all the expressive stuff, the eye pitch, the eyelids, and the mouth mechanism. It's all driven remotely.
There's one detail in the paper I really appreciated because it just speaks to the reality of having these robots interact in the real world. The safety features built into the costume.
Oh, the magnetic parts, yeah, that's essential. The main costume is a four-way stretch fabric, but the arms, the carrot nose, his little buttons, they're all held on with magnets.
So they just pop off.
They just break away on impact. So if he bumps into a wall or a person or takes a tumble, the parts just come off harmlessly. It protects the robot and whatever it hits.
Okay, let's switch gears to the control side. You built this incredibly complex, hidden machine. How do you make it move like Olaf and not just like a generic, heavy, bipedal robot?
They went with a two-layer approach. So for the simple, low-inertia parts, what they call show functions, like the arms and face, they just use classical control.
Simple PD loops and things like that.
Exactly. But for the dynamic core, the articulation backbone, so the legs and the neck, that's all driven by reinforcement learning, specifically proximal policy optimization, PPO.
So this is a policy trained in simulation, and then you have to give it some kind of artistic direction at runtime.
Precisely. The policy takes in the robot's current state, which they call serve as in, but it's also conditioned on a high-level control input, $2.
And that $2 is the link to the artist.
That's the link. It comes from an external animation engine, which is getting commands from someone puppeteering the character in real time. And to make it robust, they randomize that $2 input like crazy during training.
What's in that state vector? $ST. Because reading the paper, there are a couple of things that immediately signal this is an RL system designed for a real physical robot.
Yeah. Beyond the usual stuff like joint angles and velocities, they include two really interesting things. First, they add the last two actions, ST20 and ET2s, to the state.
To encourage smoother motion.
Right, to avoid jerky commands. But second, and this is the critical part for what comes next, they include the actuator temperature, $T, directly in the state.
So the policy is aware of how hot it's getting.
It's aware of its own temperature. And the core of the training is this imitation reward. Imitation reward. They're trying to match reference animations.
But how specific were those animations? Was it just walk forward, or was it, walk forward in character?
Oh, it was extremely specific. They used a special date generation tool to design Olaf's very particular stylized walk. The big one was his heel toe motion.
That's a very non-robotic movement.
It is, and they showed it was crucial. When they tried to train a policy without that specific heel toe reference, the walk it learned just looked robotic. It lost the character.
Okay, let's unpack these real-world constraints, because this is where the paper gets really innovative. The whole project is this battle between performance and aesthetics.
And the two biggest battles were heat and sound.
Let's start with the neck. You've got a really heavy head driven by tiny motors inside a slim neck that's wrapped in insulating fabric.
Yeah.
That just sounds like an overheating nightmare.
And it was. In their early tests, the neck actuators would hit their thermal limits all the time, so their solution was really elegant.
This is the control barrier function.
Right. They put the temperature $2 into the policy's input, and then they built a reward function around a CBF.
For listeners who aren't deep into control theory, what is a CBF doing here? Is it basically a smart safety governor?
That's a great way to put it. It's like a virtual safety brake that's always looking one step ahead. It doesn't wait for you to hit the 80°C limit and then shut down. It forces the policy to change its behavior before it gets there.
How does it do that?
The constraint basically says that as the temperature gets closer to the max, the rate of temperature increase has to go to 0. It has to slow down. So the robot learns to avoid high torque, heat-generating moves when it's already running hot.
And to train this, they needed a really accurate thermal model in their simulation.
They did. They used a first-order model and found that the heating was dominated by Joule heating, which scales with the square of the motor torque. That's 22 Dal. They fit this model to data from the real hardware, and it was very accurate.
And the results were pretty dramatic, weren't they? The baseline policy without this thermal reward.
It was unusable. It would overheat the neck pitch actuator to 100°C in about 40 seconds. Whereas the thermal aware policy just doesn't. It learns to manage its own heat budget by backing off on the torque just enough to stay safe, all while maintaining good tracking. It enables the robot to actually perform for a sustained period.
Okay, so that handles a critical safety issue.
Yeah.
Now for the purely aesthetic one, the sound. In a quiet space, that robotic thump of feet hitting the floor would completely shatter the illusion of a soft, fluffy snowman.
It's another one of those fragile believability things, so they came up with an impact reduction reward.
And how does that work?
It's pretty simple, actually. It just penalizes large changes in the foot's velocity in the vertical direction, the z-axis, right around the moment of contact. So by penalizing that delta v squared, the policy learns to place the foot down much more gently.
And it actually worked. You can measure this.
Oh, yeah. They measured a 13.5 decibel reduction in the mean sound level over a 5-minute walk. That is a huge, noticeable difference in sound. It smooths out that last little bit of motion right before impact without changing the overall look of the gait.
So we have this dynamic core solved with these really clever constrained RL policies. What about the show functions, the arms and the face?
Yeah, those are much simpler. Since they have low inertia and don't really affect the robot's balance, they're handled with classical control.
We mentioned the linkages.
Right. So the eyes use direct drive and 4-bar linkages. The arms use those spherical 5-bar linkages, and they just map the desired arm swing and pitch to the actuator commands using a polynomial fit.
I do remember the paper saying the jaw was surprisingly tricky, though.
Mm-hmm.
Not because of the mechanism, but because of the costume.
Yes. This is a perfect example of a real-world integration problem. The fabric of the costume creates these weird nonlinear forces. It pulls the jaw shut when it's closed, but then it bunches up and resists when it tries to open.
So a simple PD controller wouldn't work well.
It wouldn't be very expressive. So to fight that fabric drag, they added a feed-forward torque term to the controller. They actually did system identification on the real robot to build a mathematical model of those fabric forces, which allowed them to cancel them out.
So you've got this incredible combination. Complex hidden mechatronics, advanced RL for the dynamics, and this very careful classical control for the expressive parts. And the result was high-fidelity motion.
Very high. The tracking error was only around 4 degrees for both standing and walking. And that's really the key takeaway from this whole paper. You can bring a character with impossible proportions to life, but only if you build the solutions to real-world physical and aesthetic constraints, like heat and noise, directly into your control and learning framework.
So what does this all mean for those of you out there working on RL and robotics? It feels like a clear sign that we need to move beyond just standard robot designs and start thinking deeply about how to model all these other constraints.
Absolutely. The future isn't just about making robots more efficient. It might be about making them intentionally less efficient, but more stylized and believable.
The paper points to a couple of future research directions, and that's where I want to leave everyone's thoughts today. If you were building the next version of this robot, where would you focus your effort?
That's the big question.
Do you try to build even higher fidelity thermal models? Maybe something that accounts for, say, mechanical friction, or how the whole enclosure slowly heats up over time.
Or, and I think this might be the more interesting path, do you try to explicitly model the interaction forces between the flexible costume and the legs? Right now, they handle that with domain randomization, which is kind of a brute force approach.
You're just hoping you've covered all the possibilities.
Exactly. But if you could build an accurate model of those complex nonlinear fabric forces, you could potentially train a much more precise and efficient policy for character motion. It's these aesthetic requirements that are creating some of the most fascinating new problems in physical modeling.